Before we move on to the new topics, let's have a recap of the last class. So in the last class, we completed the Kyoto Protocol, which was wherein the previous class I had completed carbon trading. Then in the last class, I had completed the clean development mechanism and the joint implementation. Then we moved on to some other important climate change conferences, starting from 2001 onwards. I talked about Marrakesh, I talked about Copenhagen, Delhi, Bali Declaration, and all of that. Then we discussed in detail about the Kyoto Protocol. We discussed in detail about the Paris Agreement, and we discussed the salient features of Paris Agreement, and we went quite into the details of the Paris Agreement, what it means, what is nationally determined contribution, what is enhanced transparency framework, what is sustainable development mechanism, what are the important aspects of climate finance, what is loss and damage, all the key aspects of Paris Agreement we discussed. Then we also looked at one graph, if you remember, where we had displayed the various scenarios. What would happen if the world accepts the 1.5 degree pathway? What would happen if it accepts 2 degrees pathway? What would happen if the pledges are implemented partially, pledges are not implemented, business as usual? All the scenarios we had anticipated. We had all the anticipated scenarios were discussed by us. Okay. Then we looked at, after Paris, I asked you to do self-study, which was Marrakesh and Bonn. And in about 4 days from now, we will also have a couple of new things to study about Glasgow. Then we talked about some of the important organizations and conventions, in which we started with UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we kind of explained why the UNFCCC is important, what are all the various funding mechanisms. One of the important funding mechanisms we discussed was Global Environmental Facility. Then we talked about IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we also discussed why it is so important and how much of an effort is required in order to produce a report. We gave a special emphasis on the 6th assessment report of IPCC. Okay. So the 6th assessment report of IPCC, as you may remember, it had a very clear warning that what the direction that we are going is not at all good. We are dangerously close to, though it didn't use the word, but that's what it means. We are dangerously close to a tipping point. And it mentioned the socio-economic pathways. If you remember, 5 socio-economic pathways. Pathway number 1 is the most optimized one from a climate change point of view, which is the sustainable pathway. And pathway number 5 is the fossil fuel-based pathway. Okay, so that's about the 3rd class. Now in class number 4, let's take this forward and then look at some of the other important organizations. So how will this class pan out? That's also something that I want to tell you. In this class, we will look at some of the important pending organizations like United Nations Environment Program. We are going to look at it. We are going to look at what is Stockholm Conference. So interestingly, both United Nations Environment Program and Stockholm Conference are completing 50 years. So to that extent, I want you to just make a note of it somewhere, because generally when something completes 50 years, it becomes kind of a little important. We'll discuss about them. Then we'll discuss a series of reports and conventions. We will look at things like REDD, reduction from emission due to deforestation in developing countries. Then there is something called as REDD Plus. Then we will look at things around what is a carbon tax. So it's this class is going to be a combination of static part, current affairs part, and also certain concepts part. Yeah, so you will have certain things to memorize, which is the static part. You will have certain things to understand, which is the conceptual part. You will have certain things to relate, which is the current affairs part. Okay, so let's get started. Starting with United Nations Environment Program, as the year says, it's 50 years since it has been established, and needless to say, it is the single organization, or the most important organization, responsible for coordinating responses to environmental issues within the United Nations. So anything where United Nations gets involved on environment, it is invariably through UNEP. That's the first point that you need to remember. Now, what are all those things in which UNEP is heavily involved? So there are given 4 important points, 4 important environmental agreements or conventions in which UNEP is directly involved. The first one is Convention on Biological Diversity. We have not discussed this because we haven't yet come to biodiversity. Minamata Convention on Mercury. So this is once again on pollution, specifically as the name suggests, mercury pollution. The word Minamata comes from Minamata Bay in Japan. So in Japan, they had a place called Minamata Bay, and many of the Japanese ate fish from the lake. From the bay, and they fell sick. I mean, some of them it was fatal also because the fish was polluted with mercury. How did the fish get polluted with mercury? Because the water was polluted with mercury. How was the water polluted with mercury? Because there was an industry which was discharging its industrial effluents, which was high on mercury. So we'll discuss about this when we talk about water pollution. So Convention on the CBD, Minamata Convention, Convention on Migratory Species. So this is one exclusive convention focusing only on the migratory species. Yeah, which primarily involves birds, but sometimes can also involve aquatic organisms which move from one temperate to tropical or vice versa based on whether it is summer or winter. The last one is Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, which is called as the CITES. Now, why this is important is, so this, if I look at it, I would classify this more as a pre-topic. And why this is important is sometimes they will say that some of these conventions, they'll say whether UN is involved. So one type of conventions, international convention, is whether they are part of UN. The other type of organization is whether it is intergovernmental but not UN. There are some of them. Yeah, when we come to biodiversity, we'll see. The third one is private sector. Private sector. And in rare cases, these two can also coexist. That is partly private sector and partly intergovernmental. So that's the reason why it helps to know or helps to have in our head the answer to the question whether this convention has a UN component, whether it is purely intergovernmental, or whether it is purely a private sector. Okay. Now, what are the important reports? Now, reports invariably. So the entire UNEP is preliminary. Even the reports are predominantly prelims type of questions. Yeah. So what are the various types of report? Emission gap report, adaptation gap report, protected planet report, and global environmental outlook. So we are looking at 4 kinds of reports. So let's very quickly browse through these reports. These are more or less your own study. I would say, you can study by yourself, but I'll just touch upon the key aspects of this report. And all these reports are current affairs. Because if you remember, I had said at the start of the class that it's my responsibility to complete current affairs from Jan 2021 onwards. Okay, Jan 2021 till about March 22 onwards. Okay, so 15 months current affairs I need to cover. So emissions gap report 2020. So generally when a report is titled 2020, it gets released in 2021. It takes kind of several months for the report to get compiled. So what is emission gap? So that's the first interesting part. What does the report mean by the emission gap? So by emission gap, what is the meaning of emission gap? So we all know that in Paris Agreement, there was certain attempt to keep the emission at, keep the rise in the temperature below 2 degrees and also pursue effort to keep it below 1.5 degrees. Do you remember the first aim of Paris Agreement? So there were 3 aims of Paris Agreement, of which the first aim was we will go up till 2 degrees, and in some cases we will try to reduce it to 1.5 degrees, and all this was meant to be achieved by 2030. So the emission gap report funda is very clear. Because if we have to achieve 1.5 to 2 degrees, that is from the pre-industrial level, then what should be the projected emission as on 2020? Yeah. So if you were to make a graph like this, sorry, if you were to make a graph like this, so the emission, let's say, it needs to reach a particular level in 2030, let's say 2030, which means in 2020 the emission. So this is worldwide. This is worldwide divided country-wise later. So emission needs to reach this. So this curve is the desired curve, so that the Paris Agreement aim is met. So y-axis is your CO2 emission, x-axis is your year. Okay. So this is your year and this is your CO2. This is the desired. But what will happen in reality? The emission curve may be something like this. Hey, I have a request to all of you. Please try to join on time. It's highly distracting to kind of accept people when I'm in the middle of the class. Like, kindly accept this request of mine. And also sit in a place where you have a good internet connection so that you don't get drop off and keep coming back. Okay. So, yeah, where was I? Yeah, so one is the desired curve of CO2 emission, which is supposed to reduce with time. So by 2020, it needs to have a particular trajectory. And this dotted one is the actual one. This dotted one is the actual one. Now, this gap between actual and desired, are you able to see this? This is the emission gap. Is this clear? So I've just tried to convert a sentence into a graph so that the recall factor is better. So that is the emission gap report. Very simple. Now, 2020 had a very interesting area that the emission gap had chosen. You know what it had chosen? It had chosen two sectors, aviation and shipping, where it is very really difficult to pinpoint that emission of that CO2 that gets emitted from an aeroplane or from a ship. In which country should you put it? Should you put it in the source or in the destination? If so, how much? So if an aircraft takes off from Delhi airport, does the emission belong to India? You may say, yeah, because it is taking off from India. But I say, no, what if the aircraft belongs to Emirates? Yeah, and it is going to Dubai. So then, you may have a, so for the first time, the emission gap report has focused on two areas where the emission that is emitted, it is not included in any country's NDC. Now that's a very interesting thing. So where will you put if it is not included in any country's nationally determined contribution? Where will you put? So that is an area that emission gap report is trying to assess. The emission gap report also says because of COVID, though there has been a brief dip in emission, but it says in the long term there is going to be no change. We all know in COVID, the economical activity had completely come to standstill. No aircraft, therefore no emission from aircraft. No buses and trains and local cars or two-wheelers, therefore no emission from vehicles. But at the same time, thermal power plants are still running, right? Because we all were having electricity all through the year. The paddy cultivation was still happening, which means methane emission was still happening. Okay, so some amount of emission was still happening. There was a slight reduction. So what this report says is it has no significant impact. Now the report also says that many countries have pledged what is called as a net zero pledge. So net zero pledge means what it says is, and we will talk about this concept of net zero emission when we come to India and climate change, that topic. But more and more countries are committing to the fact that we will have a net zero emission by mid of this century, which is 2050. India is very reluctant. We will see India's stance mostly in the next class. So this is the first report. The next report is adaptation gap report. Now, what is adaptation gap report? Go back to Paris Agreement. Yeah, if you can, if you have the printout or slides with you. What was the second aim of the Paris Agreement? The first aim was that we have to keep the rise to below 2 degrees and if possible, reduce it to 1.5 degrees. The second aim was make the developmental model adaptive and have a climate change resilient model. If you remember it, that was the second point. So what does adaptation gap refers? The gap refers to what needs to be done and what is actually done. Very simple. What are communities doing to reduce their vulnerability? So whenever you talk of adaptation, always use the word vulnerability. These two are directly related. Anywhere. It means related to climate change. Be it in India or outside India. Whenever someone talks about adaptation, always use the word vulnerability in your answer. It has to come. Yeah. So because one is the corollary of other. High vulnerability, what does it mean? Low adaptation. Very good adaptation to climate change, what does it mean? Low vulnerability. Okay. So this report specifically tracks about overall at a global level, what is the what should be the vulnerability or how should the vulnerability decrease with time and how is vulnerability actually decreasing. So they have a metrics through which they are measuring the vulnerability. Now what they are saying is, even in this, the countries are very clear what we need to do. For example, let's say there is a country, Bangladesh. Bangladesh is very clear that because of rising sea level, we will not be able to cultivate in the delta regions because of incursion of seawater. Are you able to imagine the statement? There is Bangladesh. You can imagine the map of Bangladesh. You have Bay of Bengal towards its south, when the level of Bay of Bengal water increases, what will happen? The water will go towards north, and what was a delta region, they are no more able to do rice cultivation. Let's say, yeah. So what they are saying is every country is very good when it comes to planning, but the problem is in financing. This is also a aspect which is well known. I'll come directly to this last point on adaptation report called as nature-based solution. Now, this term has been picked up by a lot by Indian media and coaching institutes both. What is nature-based solution? As the name suggests, nature-based solution. When you are trying to adapt to climate change, try to do it in a natural way, as against a man-made way. What does this mean? For example, if there is an increased incidence of drought, yeah, suppose there is the soil is losing its moisture because of very high temperature. Okay, a man-made way to solve this problem would be drought-resistant seed variety. That's a man-made way of solving the problem. Nature way would be something like this. You've heard of this term? Mulching. Mulching means what? When you had harvested the crop, the leftover from the harvest, you just cover the ground with that. So what is the big deal? It is a big deal because whatever is the moisture in the soil, the mulching acts as a protective layer and prevents the evaporation of the soil moisture. So the mulching is on top. That is point number one. Point number two, when the mulching also decays, it kind of improves the soil fertility. Okay, so that this is an example of nature-based solution because it says whatever is going to be a nature-based solution, it will always be sustainable. It will always be sustainable. Okay, so we looked at emission gap report, adaptation gap report. These are two reports of UNEP which usually come annually. The third report comes once every 2 years. It is called as protected planet report, as it says biennial. Biennial means once in 2 years, which assesses the state of protected areas. Now, what are protected areas? When we come to biodiversity, we look at protected areas include things like biosphere reserves, national park, wildlife sanctuaries, and related. There are a couple of other categories also, but these three come in the top. It assesses what is the status of some of these activities, and it also has a report on the status of Aichi biodiversity target. So when we come to biodiversity, we look at what was Aichi biodiversity target. Aichi is a city in Japan where countries came together and agreed on some of the targets that they would like to achieve when it comes to preservation of biodiversity. Okay, so that this much is good enough as far as protected planet report is concerned. Now, why I have put this is all these reports, protected planet report, adaptation gap report, emission gap report, were all in the current affairs between January to this month. Okay, so that's why I've included. Then comes your most important report of the this UNEP, which is called as the Global Environmental Outlook. It's a very comprehensive report. Adaptation looks at one angle, how are human beings adapting, what is required, what is gap. Emission looks at one angle, how much should the emission be, what is the actual emission, what is the gap. Global Environmental Outlook, it pretty much looks at everything. And it's more of a highly theoretical points that I have to discuss, but I'll just discuss how you could remember some of the dry points. One of the things that you'll see in environment is there's a lot of content. Sometimes remembering the content becomes very difficult. So if you look at this part, yeah, what the Global Environmental Outlook is saying is that it is a consultative and a participatory process. Very interesting. So when you say it's a consultative and participatory process, means what is it? It says the report itself is formed not as a top-down approach, but by speaking to all the stakeholders of various countries. By speaking to all the stakeholders of various countries and then having a bottom-up. So whenever you say consultative and participative, the other synonym for this is a bottom-up approach and not a top-down approach. Okay. So participatory process to do what? To do an independent assessment. While it takes the input of the stakeholders, it independently puts what it thinks is correct. It's like, you listen to everyone, but you make your own decision, something like that. So it is a participative process to prepare an independent assessment of the state of environment. Okay. And not just that. So what are all the things that it says? Independent assessment of the state of environment, the effectiveness of policy response, and the possible pathways to achieve various environmental goals. So that is Global Environment Outlook for you. The flagship report of United Nations, which follows a bottom-up approach, provides an independent assessment of A, the status of the environment, B, effectiveness of policy response. What does it mean? Country-wise, it will see what has India done, what has China done, what has Russia done, in order to move towards their climate change goals. And what are the possible pathways to achieve various agreed environment goals? What are the ways? One possible pathway is, for example, increased afforestation. Another possible pathway is reduced coal usage. The third possible pathway is increased mass rapid transit system. The fourth possible pathway is 20% biodiesel in fossil fuels. So these are the various pathways through which a country can move towards its environmental goals. So there were two more points. So the 6th edition of Global Environmental Outlook is what was recently released, and hence I'm putting this in the current affairs. Otherwise, I would not have put it in the current affairs in the first place. A lot of reports for you. I know it can be a little boring sometimes, but then, as I've always said, what is boring is likely to be scoring. Now, as I said, when I was doing United Nations Environment Program, how did UNEP come into existence? It came in the year in existence in the year 1972. Okay, it was the Stockholm Conference on Environment and Human Development, which led to the birth of United Nations Environment Program. So the way you'll remember is Stockholm Conference led to the birth of United Nations Environment Program, and both of them happened in the year 1972. Now, I think 2 classes before I asked all of you as to when was the first time the world came together to talk about climate change. All of you said correctly 1992. One of you answered 1971. I said, yeah, that person is also correct, but in a different context. The reason is the first time the world had a conference on environment and human development even before 1992, which is your Stockholm Conference. So just try to understand the importance of Stockholm Conference. While the Rio Conference was primarily on climate change, Stockholm Conference was overall on environment, air, water, biodiversity, climate change, pollution, everything was discussed. Okay, so it had a scope much wider. So that's one point I want you to remember. So that's about Stockholm, and it is known as so it had a declaration. So there were 2 things. One declaration is called Stockholm Declaration. The other one is called as the Action Plan for Human Environment. These were 2 documents or 2 principles which were outcome of Stockholm Declaration and of the Stockholm Conference. Sorry, and the Stockholm Declaration is known as the Magna Carta. Magna Carta is what should I say? Magna Carta, you must have heard of it. The original Magna Carta is in a different context. When the King of England said that he is responsible to the people and all, that is my original Magna Carta. But here, when we say Magna Carta of Environmental Protection and Development, what it means is Magna Carta of Environment Protection means it is like the Bible. It is the mother document. It is an organic document on environmental protection and development. Okay, and for the first time globally, environment issues came at the forefront. So that's very significant for the first time, and therefore it's not a coincidence that they also formed an organization called UNEP, so that the what should I say? They also placed environmental issues at the forefront of of international concerns, so that people for the first time understood that it is important that issues on sustainable development cannot be handled by one single person. Interestingly, when we talk about sustainable development, somewhere in the 1970s, and I believe it was 1972 to 76 in this period, there was a paper called as Limits to Growth. So 70 is clearly limits to growth, which focuses on the fact that which for the first time used the word sustainable development in the way that we understand now. So 70s clearly there was a lot of action both on climate change, environmental protection, as well as on sustainable development. So as I said, it talks not just about pollution, it also talks about protecting wildlife, conserving natural resources. There were a lot of recommendations. What is important is India and Stockholm Conference. This point is important. If you don't remember the other points, it is still okay. What you can remember in this whole, so this once again, I expect it to be more from prelims, but it could be a mains one also. They can frame a mains question like analyze the progress that the world has made in the last 50 years since the Stockholm Conference. It could be like a motherhood statement. We'll suddenly struggle what to write and what not to, but be prepared for such a question. Okay, India and Stockholm Conference. At that time in 1972, Indira Gandhi was our prime minister. So she had gone to attend this conference. And after she came back, India initiated a slew of reforms in environment, starting with Water Act, Air Act, and Environmental Protection Act of 1986. So one by one, one thing after another, legislation started happening in the environment domain. Till then, in fact, you will, when we come to pollution, you'll also understand that the Ministry of Environment and Forest itself did not exist for the first 25 years of our independence. Only in 70s, the Ministry of Environment itself, it was the Department of Environment. Later, it became Ministry of Environment. Okay, so that's on the Stockholm Conference. That brings us to the next topic. Once again, current affairs. I have not put the whole topic as current affairs. I've just put the ranking of countries in current affairs, but the topic is current affairs because every year this comes. Climate change performance index. Climate change performance index. As the name suggests, it is a means of evaluating countries by rating them on how well they are performing when it comes to climate change. Yeah. Now, once again, from a prelims point of view, what becomes important is things like this. Is it done by United Nations? It is intergovernmental. In this case, no, it is done by this NGO called as German Watch. German Watch is also based out of Germany to enhance transparency in international climate politics. So it's a scoring system, as the name says. Index. Index means scoring system. How will you make any index? For any, in order to make any index, you need a lot of ingredients. We look at what ingredients the climate change performance index is using. But before that, what they do is they rate 57 countries and the European Union. How much? 57 countries plus all the countries of European Union, which is another 27, 28, which account for 90% of GHG emissions. And then they rate them. Okay. Rate them under what categories? Rate them under these 4 categories. How much GHG are they emitting? How much renewable energy mix they have in their overall energy mix? What is their energy use policy? Yeah, what is their energy use policy? Whether they show prudence in energy efficiency, things like that. The last one is climate policy. Do they have a formal policy, a document, a goal-based means to achieve certain climate goals? And this is the weightages. Yeah, the 4 weightages add up to 100%. Now they have ranking. Yeah, ranking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It keeps on going. Yeah, up to the 57 plus 27. Whatever the number is, 94, 95. It keeps on going. Now the first 3 ranks can be achieved if the country comes under very high category, which means climate change performance index is very high. Now, when will a country come to very high is when the country is able to do things, when the country is able to do all this, so that it is able to help in achieving the Paris climate change goal of below 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, when is a country rated very high? A country is rated very high, which is the topmost qualification under CCPI. A country is rated very high when German Watch figures out that the country is doing all the necessary things. So it's like a checkbox. It ticks this, it ticks this, it ticks this, it ticks this. When the country ticks all the things, so that it is able to adhere to less than 2 degrees as agreed in Paris Climate Change Agreement, then that country comes under very high. Okay. Now, as per this index, no country came in this very high category. Not even the Scandinavian countries, which are usually very good at least we think they are very good at managing the climate change. So that is the first thing that you should remember. Generally when these index comes, no, what are the things you need to remember? I'll tell you. This you need to remember. Who is doing it? Sorry, who is doing it? So it is German Watch who is doing it. Number of countries not really required. This is important. How many? Even though there are 14 indicators, even if you don't remember this, it's okay. But it's better to remember this. How many categories? 4 categories: GHG emission, renewable energy, energy use, and climate policy. This is the second thing you need to remember. Third thing that you need to remember is something which shows India in a positive light. India, for the first time, has been ranked in the top 10 countries in the climate change index. Now that's a big deal. There are so many countries, Scandinavian countries, some of the less population countries, all of that. India with such a huge population, so much developmental challenges, still using coal. By strictly going by the rating, we have come in the top 10. So let's look at which are those top 10 countries of the world. And there I will request you to remember one more fact. Yeah. So the way I see this part, if you have to remember it in prelims, these are the 3 factors. The German Watch, the categories, India for the first time ranked in top 10 countries. And there is one more fact, which is India and UK are the only G20 countries, this is fact number 4, that come in the top 20 in climate change performance index. You need not worry about how this number of 75.77 comes and all that. It becomes a little too technical. But suffice to say that even Sweden has not come. So no country. So you may think, well, who is rank number 1, 2, 3? Rank number 1, 2, 3 is Khali. Rank number 1, 2, 3 is no one, nobody, or no country. Okay, no country. So India for the first time has come. Obviously, it was a cause of jubilation for the Indian policymakers who felt that India's efforts in climate change, just for information, our institutionalized efforts in climate change have started from 2008 onwards, which is called as National Action Plan on Climate Change. And then after Paris Agreement, we have only ramped up our targets on renewable and emission intensity and all that. All of that has got reflected here. Okay. So sometimes these NGO things becomes very high. NGO related things becomes very high. So very high, the score is not an exact score per se. If they are able to get those 3 categories, so 80 and above. To answer your question, it is 80 and above. It's very high. So none of them have got 80. Sweden is the closest country that has come very close to it. So that is where we are. Okay. So this brings me to one question. Are you aware of any other famous German-based NGO? And when that German-based NGO brings out its index, it kind of shakes the countries. Anything that you can, and it's not related to environment. Any idea? Okay, good guess. Greenpeace. I'm actually not sure. You may be right, but I was looking for some other answer. They also rate countries, but Greenpeace is related to environment. I'm saying this NGO is not related to environment. So have you heard of this? Let me write this. Excellent, Abhishek. I was about to type it. You have mentioned it. Transparency International. So this country comes up with this corruption index among countries. Okay. So India has gone up, it has come down and all that. So I was about to type it and Abhishek has mentioned it. So it is Transparency International. So Transparency International is also German, this is also German, but I think the cities is different. This guy is from Berlin, whereas Transparency International is from Bonn. Okay, great guys, good. Oh yes. So the reason why I have put this map is hopefully you can remember who are all the chief villains as far as the climate change performance index is concerned. High. Yeah. So there is no very high. So there are only 4 categories: high, medium, low, and very low. So India, surprisingly, you are seeing that it is in the high category. So is UK. Yes, so are the Scandinavian countries. Broadly, these are the green guys. Oh yeah, I also see that Morocco is here. This is also green, and I also see Portugal is also green. Oh, interesting. I didn't see that. Okay, so you have a couple of countries which are in the high category. Okay, I think this green guy has to be Lithuania. I think if you look at the map, one second. Yeah, Lithuania. So this is Lithuania. Okay, so Lithuania, Scandinavian countries, India, Morocco, Portugal, and United Kingdom. These guys are the high. Now, who is the other extreme? All the developed countries, all the superpowers, all the countries which provide a lot of comfort to their own citizens: US, Canada, Australia, Russia, Mongolia. Oh, I'm sorry, not Mongolia. It's one of the CIS countries. I'm sorry, Mongolia is here. One of the CIS countries, most probably Kazakhstan, going by the size, but we'll still check it. Kazakhstan. China comes in somewhat in the medium category. The bad guys also happen to be this country. Any idea what is this country? Easy to guess, actually. Can someone tell me what is this country? And this. Very good. Saudi, yes. Good, Bhavna. How about this? This country? I'm sure geography optional guys will do well. Bhavna being one of them. Yes, that's correct. Iran. Very good, Abhishek. Iran. Super. So Iran and Saudi, it is not very difficult to guess, no, why their climate change performance index is poor, because there is going to be so much emission, no. They keep on drilling, keep on exploring oil, natural gas, exporting it to countries. Obviously, their CCPI is likely to be poor. So these are some of the countries where the climate change performance index is poor. So just a map for you so that you can remember. And you may think then, sir, why are these countries all in gray? Because these countries anyway do not cause that much of CO2 emission. If you remember, the entire world was not included. What was included was 57 countries and European Union. Okay, so that's why these countries do not come in the graph itself, because their emission is so low as to be considered as insignificant. Okay. Now the next concept or organization or initiative, whatever you call it, it's called as the RED, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation in Developing Countries. REDD, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation in Developing Countries. Try to understand what is it saying. What it says is, whenever there is deforestation, there is what is going to happen to the emission? The emission is going to rise. That's clear. Reducing that emission, which means how will you do it? By, instead of deforestation, you will do afforestation. Correct? So that's the whole funda. Okay. So for the first time in 2005, a lot of countries on the equator, a lot of countries which have tropical rainforest came together. It's around 50 plus more countries. They came together under a banner called as Coalition for, sorry, this is not of, this is for Coalition for Rainforest Countries. Coalition for Rainforest Nations, sorry, Coalition for Rainforest Nations. Countries like Nicaragua, Panama, Guatemala, the Western African countries, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, you know what I'm referring to, yeah, and some of the Southeast Asian countries which have rainforest. They came and they put forward this proposal that we should have a scheme or a mechanism which will focus on reducing the emissions, or in other words, reduce the increasing emission due to deforestation. Yeah, I hope the purpose is clear. When you do deforestation, the emission increases. How do we reduce it? Yeah, that is the objective of this. So originally it was called RED, then it came to be known as RED Plus. So RED Plus what they did was, here it is deforestation in developing countries, reducing emissions from the deforestation. In RED Plus, what they added was, they added 2-3 terms: sustainable management of forest, conservation and enhancement of carbon stocks. So they just added to make the scope a little bit more wider. Sometimes it happens, no, when you when you, I think even in constitution you have it, no? The word socialist and secular, they were added much after. In 1950, if you are just sovereign, what was it? Republic, sovereign. What were the other two terms? Sovereign republic, I mean, democratic republic. Yeah, sorry, sovereign, democratic, and republic. Socialist and secular, they were added much later during Indira Gandhi's time. In fact, that was a question this year in 2021. If I remember it, how was the constitution preamble or something at the time of framing the constitution in 1950? So red plus is something similar to this. So you had some objective when you started. 6 years down the line, you had a couple of more objectives. Now, what is the meaning of this forest carbon stocks? So, in terms of simple yes or no, can someone tell me yes or no whether forests contain carbon? Do they contain carbon? I agree they absorb carbon dioxide, but do they forests contain carbon? Any idea? Okay, so many of you are saying yes, they contain carbon. Now, suppose I say, yeah, peatlands also, you're right, Papa, but the forest themselves also a good source of carbon. Conservation and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. Conservation of forest carbon stocks means what? Conservation of trees. Conservation of forest itself. Once you conserve the forest, you can be sure that the carbon stocks are also conserved. How do you enhance a forest carbon stock? How do you enhance it? Yeah? Conserve is understandable. How do you enhance a forest carbon stock? Any idea? That is done by reclaiming degraded forest. For example, there is a forest which has been, let's say, has been degraded either due to natural or man-made causes, let's say fire, for example, or due to shifting cultivation, that forest has been here. You're trying to reclaim that forest by planting new trees. So that's reclamation. So now what you have done, you are creating more carbon sinks because as the tree grows, that becomes a solid carbon sink for you. Okay, I hope that's clear. So that's what REDD+ does. And other than this, there are some more facts which I feel you can read by yourself. It's important to know that there is something called REDD and REDD+ as far as the international climate change or GHG emissions is concerned. Okay. That brings us to a topic which is partly environmental and partly economics. I thought I would as well cover this here in the environment part itself. It is the concept of carbon tax. In fact, before we go through all these points, let's just look at this figure. Though the heading is called carbon dividend, I will come and we'll revisit this and we'll explain or we'll try to understand the difference between a carbon tax and a carbon dividend. Okay. So let's first look at the 3 points which are mentioned in the boxes, starting with this one. Carbon tax, the simple funda is, as the name suggests, tax on carbon. So what does that mean? Tax on products which during their stages of production or during their use cause CO2 emission. That is simple. Yeah. So what does first point say? CO2 fee is charged on natural gas, coal, and mineral oil products because using these products, what it does, it adds to GHG emissions and global warming. Okay. Now, what the government does in India, we don't have this kind of a carbon tax. We don't put something called as a heading called carbon tax, but we deal it in a different way. I'll come to it. There are 2 concepts in India called as perform, achieve, trade, and renewable energy certificate. So both I'll discuss when we come to India and climate change. We don't have a tax called as a carbon tax, but it is done in a roundabout manner in India. But carbon tax is being done, or it is at least being proposed and deliberated in at least 2 dozen countries. At least 24, 25 countries, they are thinking of having carbon tax. Okay. So what you do? Anything that is pollution, you add tax to it, either during the production or during its use. Now, what will happen as a result of which? Those products which are GHG intensive, what do they become? They become more expensive. So what all that you're doing is you added this. So what happens? Some of the products the product, some of the products which are GHG emission, their price increases. Versus, so what will the Janta or the normal public do? The energy efficient product values, price, I won't say price, the demand will go up. Here the price has gone up. So relatively what will happen is an energy efficient product will appear a little more attractive to the customer. So there is a general tendency to move from GHG emission product to energy efficient product, even though energy efficient product may otherwise be expensive. Okay, so there is some amount of economic demand supply that's working here. You added a tax, the product which is GHG, high GHG emitter, its cost has gone up. So relatively the energy efficient product which was otherwise expensive now becomes a little affordable. Okay, now what you do, the government, what it does is it collects the tax. Suppose in India government has collected the tax. So this tax, what will it do? It puts it in a separate kitty. Yeah, it puts it in a separate kitty. Let's say it's called the carbon tax kitty, and that can be used for targeting people. For example, that can be used for certain specific development projects. Or better still, that can be used in schemes like direct bank transfer. So what you have done, on one hand, you have ensured that you have a source of revenue. How? By taxing products which are causing climate change. So by doing that, what you have done, you are forcing people to use less GHG emission things. So on one hand, you get the revenue. On the other hand, you're also moving towards your climate change goal. So both the criteria is getting met. And what you do is the money that you have received, you are able to target it. You know, while the point 2 here says that the revenues are evenly distributed among citizens, it need not always be so. It need not always be evenly. It could be a very targeted distribution, like the targeted, the direct bank transfer scheme, where you identify people below poverty line or whatever your criteria may be, and you transfer money into their account. So when you transfer money into their account, their purchasing power improves. When purchasing power improves, obviously there is a economical activity, and there is a general economical growth and development that is happening. Now, so what has happened? You have taxed the GHG emitting products. You have given it to the public, and then the public brings it back into the economy only. It brings it back into the economy. So what you have done, this carbon, which is a tax at the start, actually becomes a dividend by the time it circulates back into the economy. Okay, so that's why though it is a carbon tax to start with, but when you look at the full picture, it is actually called as a carbon dividend. So both terms are similar, but carbon dividend, the term is used when the tax that was collected is given to people over here, and people over here are using it back to the economy. Hence the name carbon dividend. Okay. Now, if this picture is clear, let's quickly move to the points about carbon tax. This won't take us a lot of time. There are a few important points here also. As I said, first is the definition. So what is the definition? The definition is carbon tax is levied on carbon emissions required to produce goods and services. Yeah. So this definition we have done. Now, what is the objective? Yeah, objective I have not discussed that much in detail. The first objective is to make visible the hidden social cost of carbon emission. Hidden social cost of carbon emission. So whenever there is a carbon emission, there is a global warming. So what is let's look at an example of hidden cost. What do we mean by hidden social cost? So a hidden social cost would be, let's say there is a CO2 emission increase. Then what happens to the sea level? Sea level will increase. Now what happens to the fishermen? So they have to migrate to slightly backwards. They have to come into the land. So when they migrate, what is going to happen to them? There is a cost involved. One, physically they have to have a cost, and second, it also has a cost to the government. Why? Because the government has to do rehabilitation and resettlement. Are you able to understand this? This is an example of a social cost. You emitted a lot of CO2. Imagine I am a rich industrialist. I have 10 power plants at my disposal, and all of them are based on coal. So I have been emitting CO2. Sea level, am I going to get impacted? No, because I can have homes anywhere, either sea facing or in a hill station. Doesn't make an impact. Who is going to get impacted? The fishermen. So the fishermen become very vulnerable. Now they have to move their location. So what will they do? They'll have to move a little towards the land area which is not yet submerged. But then if there is already present there, it will cause some kind of a social tension. Then the government will step in. It has to ensure some kind of resettlement and rehabilitation. That is an example of social cost. It may even cause unrest between the fishermen who are new to that place versus the existing population. So now all of this, what is the root cause? Excess CO2. Have we punished the guy in any way? We haven't. How can we punish? We can punish by putting a tax. Is that the most desirable one? That is debatable, which we can discuss later also. I'll just touch upon this. But many economists feel that carbon tax is a great way of making the polluter pay. This is what many economists feel. Okay. So the first objective is to make visible the hidden social cost of carbon emission. That is very clear. The second objective is decrease demand for high emission goods and services. That is natural, no? When the price of goods which during their production has emitted a lot of CO2, their cost gets added up. When the cost gets added up, everything remaining same, simple demand supply economics, and the cost increases, the demand will come down. So as a concept, carbon tax is called as a Pigovian tax. So Pigou was a British economist who for the first time suggested Pigou, that is Pigou. He said that any market activity that generates negative externalities. So here is another term. Any market activity that generates negative externality needs to be taxed. Simple funda. I am an industrialist. Let's say I have a leather tanning factory. Okay. What I do, I wash the leather using the water and I let the water go. Now, as you may be aware, leather, any water that is used for cleaning leather, it's highly polluted with microorganisms. That has caused a negative externality. Now, what is the meaning of negative externality? Externality means cost. In this case, it's a cost because we're talking of negative externality. Cost for a third party who did not agree to it. Means when I, as a leather tanning factory, have polluted the water, which is going to go and mix with the river, which is a water source for the people, I am imposing health cost on the people. And have I asked their permission? I have not asked. So it's a negative externality. Since it's a negative externality, you have to pay a tax. So that is the basic concept of Pigovian tax. Okay. And one of the reasons why economists prefer this is they say that it can be implemented. From an implementation point of view, it's easy. Okay. Now, one small challenge. I said that carbon tax is preferred by economists. One small challenge is, in fact, there are two small challenges. In terms of carbon tax, suppose I am an industrialist, I am producing steel, let's say. Yeah, production of steel, very energy intensive. You are taxing me. You are saying your steel, in your steel production, you have emitted 120 tons of CO2. Therefore, per ton, I am going to put this much rupees. Therefore, for 120 tons, I have put this. What will I do as a businessman? Am I going to absorb that tax? What will I do? Logically, what will I do? If you were a businessman, what will you do? Think about it. No businessman will absorb it. So, the easiest thing that he will do is pass it on to the consumers. What is that kind of a tax where you levy on someone, but eventually it gets impacted on someone else? What is that kind of a tax called? Have you heard of it? A tax which is levied on the source, but eventually it is paid by someone else. Eventually, exactly. It's called as an indirect tax. Good job. It's an indirect tax. So to that extent, carbon tax is an indirect tax because eventually the industrialist or whoever is producing the good, he will just increase the price of the good. But there is a cost to him. Why? Because the cost of his good has increased, the demand is likely to decrease. Probably. It depends on the other factors. Okay. So that's one problem I see of carbon tax. But economists feel among other options, this is still the best option. Yeah. So if you have to choose between me and the reputed economist, obviously you have to choose the reputed economist. That's what they are saying. This seems to be a better option. Now, the second problem with carbon taxes, it is regressive. Regressive. Now, before we understand regressive, can someone tell me how will you define India's taxation, income tax? You have various slabs. Any idea what is the term that we use for India's taxation of people? Up to 5 lakh, I'm just giving a hypothetical, no tax rate. 5 to 10 lakh, X percentage. 10 to 20, X percentage. Excellent. So it's a progressive taxation. In India, what we have is progressive taxation. What it means is higher your income, greater is the slab of your taxation. I'm sure all of you would have touched upon this. You have a up to 5 lakh, there is no complete exemption. I don't know the slab, I'm just giving an idea. 5 to 10 lakhs, let's say 5%. 10 lakhs to 20 lakhs if is your annual income, then you're doing 10% of the 10 to 20 lakhs. Beyond 20 lakhs, then let's say 30%. So higher the income, let the person pay more. Somewhat you can say socialism at work here. If someone is able to pay more, why not get more? That's the principle. So that's an example of progressive taxation. Carbon tax is considered regressive. Why? Because a lower income household, think about it, will it buy, all other things being same, will it buy a 40-watt incandescent bulb or a LED lamp? I'm talking of a working class. Yeah, most probably the 40-watt incandescent. Yeah, why? Because it is much cheaper. But in that cheaper cost also there is a tax. Now, very interesting concept. You wanted to tax a rich guy whose industry is causing CO2, but who is ending up paying it? A poor guy who is not able to afford an energy efficient product. I'm slightly dramatizing it. It's not that bad. But in order to explain this point number 5. Now, therefore, what as a government you will do? The tax that you have collected. Now let's go back to this page. So in order to prevent in order to prevent 0.5 from happening, what you do is you do this direct bank transfer or some kind of a development for the poor people or the below poverty line who have actually paid the carbon tax. Yeah, and when the poor person has paid the carbon tax, but it is your duty to somehow use that revenue. Whom will you use it on? You will use it on someone who badly needs it. And that is why this is called as a carbon dividend. So it started as a carbon tax on the rich person, but it goes back into the economy as carbon dividend in the form of development projects or direct bank transfer. This is the overall concept of carbon tax and carbon dividend. I would encourage you to do a little bit of an analysis because in the first class I told environment is related with a lot of subjects. Sometimes it is related to polity, sometimes related to geography, so on and so forth. Sometimes it is also related to economy as we have seen now. Okay, so that's on the concept of carbon tax. So now we are actually towards the end of organizations, and that is why we are now. I'm also trying to include some of the current affairs under the heading climate change. We are still on heading of climate change. We have not come to India. India and climate change is a separate topic altogether. I'm still looking at the global scenario. So all topics on global scenario I'm going to cover first. So in one of these months, there was this topic on marine heat waves. Heat waves you would have heard, even in land heat waves comes. If we always say, there is a heat wave sweeping northern part of India, people lose their lives either due to sunstroke or exhaustion and whatnot. A similar heat wave can also happen in oceans. That's called as marine heat wave. Marine is ocean, marine heat wave. The first is a definition of heat wave. The simple definition is every season, that is summer, winter, spring, autumn. So they divide the season into 4. And they say, in this month, there is a threshold. In summer, this is what maximum ocean temperature can go. In winter, slightly low. Let's say in spring, somewhere in between, autumn also somewhere in between. They have a threshold. When the seawater crosses the threshold and remains above the threshold for 5 consecutive days, it's called as a heat wave. Very simple definition. Yeah, every season has a threshold. And when the seawater crosses the threshold and stays there for 5 days or more, it becomes a marine heat wave. Now, what is the big deal about marine heat wave? We may say if it happens on land, people are dying. Therefore, it's a cause of concern. Why is it a cause of concern when it happens on the ocean? Okay. In order to understand this, it is important to understand 3 layers in the ocean. I'm not going into too much of depth. I think the geography optional students may have to go a little more in depth. Sometimes in geography optional paper, you'll have a question related to current affairs. So let me try to explain this figure. It's a little involved, but I am not able to completely neglect this because I felt that it is still important. So you are able to see this south. South means Antarctic. Yeah. Then 0 is equator, north. So imagine the earth like this. Oh, sorry. Imagine the earth like this. So this is Antarctic. This is Arctic. And this is the equator. So you have a lot of ocean here. Okay. Now, what they are saying is, are you able to see the 3 layers? The topmost layer is called as a mixed layer. The bottommost layer is called as the deep layer. In between these 2 layers is a band called as pinocline. Pinocline. We'll see what it is. Not worry too much. Now, so this whole figure you need not remember, guys. If you think it is too complicated, all that they have shown is that the thickness of the mixed layer varies with latitude. That is the only message that they are communicating. That is, it is lowest in the equator and highest somewhat in the mid latitudes. So this layer completely disappears at the pole. That's another thing that you may want to remember. There is no mixed layer both at the poles, north or south pole, because it is pretty much frozen. So there is no concept of mixed layer there. But what you have only is predominantly the deep layer. Okay. Now, what does this mixed layer do? I am going to small class exercise I wanted to do. Let's say okay. Let me call this as temperature, comma, density. Temperature, comma, density. The x-axis, y-axis is depth. Okay. Now, first question to you, because I think unless I get answers from you, I'll not have the satisfaction whether I have made it clear to you. First question to you is temperature between these 3 layers, mixed, pinocline, deep layer. Where do you think the temperature is likely to be the highest? Where do you think the temperature is likely to be highest? It's 3 layers. Top, middle, bottom. If I can simplify it. Any idea? Okay, someone has answered. Top, okay. 2 people have said top. Oh, good. And the simple reason why it is at top is the sunlight is able to penetrate only the first 100, 150 meters. Very simple. So good. So what I'll do is I will, let's say the temperature. So this is depth. No? Let me divide this into 3 parts. 1, 2, 3. So the first layer is the mixed layer. The second layer is pinocline. Third layer is deep layer. So let's say the temperature is high here. Let's say this is 30 degrees, let's say. Okay. Now, as you go deep, the temperature comes down. Yeah, now the other important, okay, the second question before move further. The second question is this mixed layer, that is the top 100 meters, let's say. Yeah, it's usually around, it goes on up to 300 meters, but let's say the top 100 meters where there is sunlight. How even do you think it is? What I'm saying is, will the temperature be more or less constant, or it will vary drastically as you go down? The question is, will the temperature be more or less constant for the entire 100 meters, or will it vary drastically? with depth? Slightly tough question if you've not studied it before, but we'll try to explain. Will it remain same or will it change within that 100 meters? Vary with depth, okay. Constant, okay. Gradual variation with depth, vary with depth, constant. Any other point of view? Okay, no problem. Now, what happens is, before I give the answer, let me say this. You can imagine the ocean surface, right? So there is sunlight. There is sunlight that is going to hit the ocean surface. Yeah, the sunlight is hitting the ocean surface. What happens to the water there? The water will evaporate. Do you agree? Which means the topmost layer of the water is no more in the ocean. It has evaporated. So what happens to the layer below that? That will come up. Do you agree? Yeah, the layer which was less just beneath the top has now become the top, and that will start to evaporate. Yeah, so there is, if I may say, a movement, an upward movement of water because of evaporation. Point number one. The second point is when there is wind or slight waves. What do the waves do? They kind of mix the water up and down. So there is if you go very, very minute, there is a very minor variation, but for all practical purpose, it is a constant temperature, which means, for the sake of our understanding, the temperature till this point is constant. Are you able to understand the meaning of this vertical line? The temperature is the same at the ocean surface, 0 meter. It is the same at, let's say, minus 25 meter, minus 50 meter, minus 75 meter, and minus 100 meter. Temperature is the same. Now, at the deep ocean level, let's say if this is 30, let's say this is somewhat, let's say 25 degrees. At the deep ocean level, below 3000 meter, the temperature is only 25 degrees. So here you have one region, solid mass, which has a constant temperature. Here you have another solid thickness of ocean depth where you have another constant temperature. Now, this region, which is, let's say, between 1500 to 300 meter, there is a drastic variation of temperature. Sorry, it's only one line. There is a drastic variation of temperature. This is called as thermocline. When it comes to temperature, exactly the same thing happens for density. The variation of density, the line or the region is called as thermocline. So why I'm saying all this when we are talking about the marine heat wave is what this news article had said, that this thickness is decreasing. This thickness is decreasing. Now I want to ask you another question. Think and answer me. According to you, at what depth, if I collect all the biomass, the living biomass, at what depth do you think you will find maximum flora and fauna in the ocean? You will find it across depths. That's given. There are organisms that live very, very deep also. But typically, if you had to choose between three options, mixed layer, thermocline, deep layer, at what depth do you think you can find maximum biodiversity? Good. So there seems to be unanimity. Mixed layer. Two reasons. It is in the mixed layer that because of sunlight penetration, you're going to have phytoplankton. Exactly. You're going to have phytoplankton. Now, once phytoplankton comes, zooplankton will come. Zooplankton ke piche, just behind zooplankton, your small fishes will come. Then the large fishes will come. That is point number one. Point number two, as you go deep and deep, what is going to happen to the pressure? Any idea? Pressure? It will increase enormously. Water column, exactly. It's a heavy water column. It will increase enormously. So for all practical purpose, this region is unlikely to have any organisms. Of course, you may say that there are some organisms called as chemotrophs. If you have come across the term chemotrophs, yeah. So there are some specialized microorganisms which are close to a earth vent, which gives them some heat. Okay, so they are able to survive. But barring those exceptions, your maximum biodiversity is in this region. Now, why? All this is fine. You said sunlight was all that's fine. Now, what made the biodiversity possible was the temperature was constant. That's the beauty. The mixed layer, I'm referring to this part. The mixed layer for the 300-meter temperature is constant. Now, a fish, any fish, you take maybe a dolphin or a shark or whatever, they are very happy to move between 300 meters to 0 meter because the temperature is the same, even though the pressure changes a little bit, the temperature is the same. Now, because of continuous global warming, the rate of evaporation is high. Let's say the mixed layer, you see at the equator, as it is, the mixed layer is very low. With continuous global warming, what this report had said that this mixed layer thickness will further decrease. Now, if this mixed layer is further decreased, then what is the new ocean surface? I'm just hypothetically saying the new ocean surface becomes this line, no? Can organisms survive when the temperature and the density is so drastically varying? They cannot survive. Are you kind of able to understand the difference? What happens when the mixed layer thickness comes down? When the mixed layer thickness comes down, let's say 90% of the biodiversity in this depth, they will get threatened. Yeah, they will face serious problem. So that is why the marine heat wave has to be taken a little seriously. So I have not deliberately drawn this graph here. I thought we will do this as a class exercise. So if you have maybe just noted it down, it will be helpful. So the graph that you need to remember is constant temperature, drastic variation in temperature, and then once again constant temperature. So this is layer 1, this is layer 2, this is layer 2, L2, this is L1, and this is layer 3. When L1 disappears, L2 becomes L1, and then it has a drastic variation in the temperature, which will unsettle the organisms. Okay, I think we've had enough of marine waves. Let's look at another current affairs topic. Once again, you can just hear this out. There isn't much to really understand in this. It kind of shook me off when I heard this news. So I thought, as aspirant, you must have come across this news, or we can discuss it now. The news was Amazon forest is no longer acting as a carbon sink. When I'm sure you would have also read it. When I was growing up in school days, college days, we used to call Amazon, or at least I have seen newspapers calling Amazon as the lungs of the world, because it does purification of the entire atmospheric air system. Now they are saying Amazon is a net CO2 emitter. So that's a very dangerous thing to happen. If the biggest rainforest of the world put together becomes a net CO2 emission, then we are in trouble. Now you may say, but how can it be a net CO2 emitter? Because ultimately there are some forests. The problem is, one, environmental, and two, political. Okay, so in fact, let me come to the political part first, which is point number 5. In case you've not heard of this gentleman, you can just Google him. Bolsonaro. So he's been the president of Brazil for quite some time, and he's a very controversial guy because he feels Brazil is backward because of lack of industrialization. So what should I do? I should put up more industries. Where do I put more industries? By removing trees from Amazon. That was a simple matter. Okay. So if you look at the map of South America, the eastern part of South America, can you imagine eastern part of South America, which is Brazil, the eastern part of Brazil. That part, the Amazon forest, has been more or less completely removed. In fact, yeah, are you able to see this map? Yeah, here. So the thick green is the one where the canopy density is good. The eastern part, you see that it is no more a tropical rainforest. In fact, it's something like converted forest, sub-mountain forest, etc. But the real Amazon rainforest, its value has decreased. Okay. So one political reason is the president's policy. They say many have really blamed him for a lot of bad things that has happened to Brazil. So that is one. The second thing is caused by fires. So once again, the Brazil also is a fairly populous country. And if you look at some of the Brazil cities, all the major cities, they all will be on the eastern coast. You look at Rio de Janeiro, Brasilia, some of the other big cities, they're all on the eastern coast. The population is moving from east towards the west, which means they are encroaching into Amazon. Okay, reasons why the large part of Amazon has there is a land use change. Now here you can use the word land use change, the term that we used when we were talking about GHG gas. You can use the term land use change, where some part of forest has got converted to agriculture land, losing CO2. Some part of forest has directly got converted into industries. So once again, so the industries have started emitting CO2. That's why the whole region of Amazon is now considered as a carbon source rather than carbon sink. And I've also mentioned some more facts about Amazon. Really helps to know. You could use these facts in essay or something. So the area of Amazon is twice the area of India. So that's the first thing that really hits you. Amazon basin. Yeah, so it's 60 lakh square kilometer. India itself is 32 lakh square kilometer. Is our area. It's about 60 lakh square kilometer, and they are home to some of the biodiversities which you can see only in Amazon. And not just that, there are certain isolated tribes which remain isolated and away from the human civilization. So as more and more the people are pushing or cutting the Amazon forest, they are coming in direct conflict with these tribes. Obviously, the tribes are dying because the war is not equal. No, one is using bow and arrow, other is using a gun. So obviously, a lot of tribes have also been killed, is what the reports have stated. Okay. Wherever I felt that a small video, 2-3 minutes video can help, I have attached a video. The State of Global Climate Report is one such report where it is very nicely presented in a video. So I've included that. This is a report by World Meteorological Organization, State of Global Climate Report 2020. In this, if someone is not sure what is a La Nina, they can just read it, because explaining El Nino and La Nina, which is anyway geography, I thought someone can just Google and find out what is La Nina. So one of the important observations of this report is 2020 is one of the warmest years on record. The warmest year on record, despite a cooling La Nina event. That's important. So if there was an El Nino event, anyway that year would be very warm. But in case of a La Nina, overall the global temperatures have been higher. Now, how much higher have they been? They have been higher by 1.2 degrees Celsius. Now imagine, as on 2020, we are already 1.2 degrees Celsius above the industrial level. Now, what is Paris climate change's target? We should definitely be less than 2 degrees and strive for 1.5 degrees, which means what is the buffer we have got? The buffer we have got with respect to 1.5 degrees is only 0.3 degrees. So we are actually very close to reaching the target set by Paris Agreement. And there are some more aspects that, the last 6 years have been the warmest. 2011 to 2010 has been the warmest decade, so on and so forth. And the whole report has 5 indicators of irreversible damage of climate change. 5 indicators. So it has what should I say? It has summarized its report under 5 different headings and says, therefore, the global climate change is irreversible. So the first evidence it presents is something that we have already discussed in class 1 or 2, where the GHG emissions have already crossed 410 parts per million. You remember the first graph of NASA, where I showed last 8 lakh years, the CO2 emission is below 300, and from 1950 it increased above 300 and all that. So this this report by WMO, it confirms what we already know, that we are actually in a runaway global warming. So this is about the atmosphere. So GHG, you can say, it tackles the which sphere? Atmosphere. Oceans. Now the second aspect, it talks about hydrosphere. 80% of oceans have experienced at least one marine heat wave. Good, no? You're able to relate this news with the news that we just analyzed, marine heat wave. 80% of the ocean area, that's massive. That's really massive. It's not 10, 20. 80% of the ocean area has experienced at least one marine heat wave in the year 2020. Clear evidence that oceans are absorbing more heat than what they are supposed to. Once again, hydrosphere. It says that sea level had slightly reduced. So this was an exception. Generally, it is better to remember the exceptions from a prelims point of view. All things are going bad, but sea level alone, it says it was rising, and it has kind of steadied and actually dipped a little bit in 2020. which probably is attributed to La Nina. So those who don't know La Nina, I would suggest that you just read it. It's there in your basic NCERT geography. You can also Google it and read it. The last 2 points is about cryosphere. So the way you could remember is 1 point was on atmosphere, GHG emission. 2 points on hydrosphere, one on sea level rise, other is marine heat wave. 2 points on cryosphere. What is cryosphere? That area of Earth is covered with ice. So in cryosphere, it looks at both the poles, the North Pole as well as the South Pole. The North Pole, it says the Arctic sea ice is the second lowest spread on record. So when you say Arctic sea ice, no? So the area of the Arctic sea ice, it has been the lowest on record. In fact, the lowest was in 2012, I think. So after 2012, this is the second lowest. So 2012 and now 2020. So these were the lowest on record. What it says is the area. If you look from the top, this ice area, it is the lowest till date, second lowest till date. And it says the Antarctica ice continues to, Antarctica as a planet continues to lose ice, a trend that has accelerated since 2005. So these are some of the high level inputs of the state of global warming report by WMO, and some facts about WMO which I'm not discussing. You can just read it. These are factual things. Okay. With that, we end climate change, global warming, organizations, current affairs related to climate change. We end all. So that's a substantial portion. So I am slightly dividing ozone depletion separate from climate change. Okay. Though in the very first class, all of you came to the consensus that ozone depletion does cause some amount of climate change, but we also concluded that it is not a significant effect. Okay. So what I want you to tell you is by this class, since we are in class 4, we have completed climate change international dimension. We have not yet come to national dimension. That's a separate story, which we will discuss in today's class and next class. But the international dimension we have completed. Now it's quite possible, let me admit here, it's quite possible that I might have missed few international organizations or conventions. If so, I've given you the printouts. You make a file system as new conventions or reports or indices keep coming, keep inserting the pages at the right place. That's why if you see in today's class, I have for today's class, one, as I committed in the last class, I have given you the notes before. And second, I have also given to you in the page format. Yeah, so that when you take printout back to back, these 90 slides would easily come in 90 divided by 4. Let's say 20 to 23 pages is what you need to take printout. So you always feel a little happy, when the amount of study material that you have to study is a little less. So it has a psychological bearing also. And because the font that I have used is 20 Arial, even with a lower zoomed out version, you will still be able to read it comfortably. That's what my feel is. In case someone has any problem, just let me know. I'll make the changes. Let's move on to ozone depletion. We have a couple of slides on ozone depletion and some interesting points about ozone depletion. We will also compare the global efforts in phasing out the ozone depleting substances, why it has been successful vis-a-vis the climate change efforts. Okay, so these are some of the points which we will discuss. Okay, so ozone depletion and ozone hole. These are two terms that that use interchangeably. The first point tries to differentiate these two. So when the depletion becomes very bad, so we all understand depletion, when the depletion becomes very bad, especially in the polar regions, so much so that the concentration is very, very low, we call it as a ozone hole. Simple. Yeah, ozone hole is a severe form of ozone depletion, usually found around the polar regions. What is the main reason? Collectively, there are some substances which are called as ozone depleting substances. So what do they include? They include your refrigerants. Have you seen, whenever your air conditioner loses its cooling capacity, sometimes you'll hear the AC mechanic saying, "Sir, you need to fill fluid." Yeah, he'll say, "Gas. Sorry, you need to fill the gas." So that gas is freon. Okay, in fact, several gases. One gas is freon. It's also used in refrigerants, and they act as ozone depleting substance. Eventually, they get released into the atmosphere and they act as ozone depleting substances. So we have refrigerants, coolants also. Yeah, coolant is not mentioned here. Some industrial solvents, propellants, and foam blowing agents. All of this together are called as ozone depleting substances. Now, as we know, what does ozone do? Ozone prevents the harmful ultraviolet light from passing through the Earth's atmosphere. What does it do? It prevents ultraviolet rays from passing through the Earth's atmosphere. Now, while generally we all know that it causes skin cancer, please note that it can also cause sunburn, permanent blindness, and cataract. Sometimes these are the lesser known aspects are asked sometimes in the exam. Therefore, please remember it is not just skin cancer. It can also cause sunburns, permanent blindness, and cataract. Just as we have Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement for climate change, we have Montreal Protocol. So, just a small point here. So, there was also a Montreal Conference on Climate Change. That is different. This is different. Yeah, in both places you'll find Montreal. 2005 Montreal Conference was for climate change. 1987 Montreal Protocol is for phasing out or banning the production of chlorofluorocarbon, halogens, and other ozone depleting substances. The unit of measurement of ozone is called Dobson. And this point is very important. I'm sorry. Yeah, this point is very important. It is considered as the most successful international environment agreement till date. In fact, not just environmental agreement, it is considered as the most successful international agreement till date. Montreal Protocol. Now, as far as climate change was concerned, you had Kyoto Protocol in 1997, right? But that was preceded by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So generally, there is a convention followed by a protocol. Similarly, in ozone case, the case of ozone, you had Vienna Convention, which led to Montreal Protocol. Okay, so you can remember this as a pair. What was UNFCCC to Kyoto Protocol? Vienna Convention is to Montreal Protocol. So Vienna Convention happened in the year 1985 and Montreal Protocol was 1987. Okay. So some more points. So keep your chat box ready. I have a couple of questions for you. So the UV rays, the UV rays, collectively they are called as ultraviolet. Yeah, from 400 nanometer to 200 nanometer, they are collectively called as UV ray. But within that, there are three categories: UVA, UVB, and UVC. Okay. Now, I have just touched this once in the first or the second class. And let me see if some of you remember it. Which of those three between A, B, and C do you think is going to be the most harmful? Most harmful. Any idea? Which one of the three between A, B, C? C is most harmful. Okay. And the reason being, you can write it as one word because it has high, low, something. Low wavelength. Yes, it has high frequency or low wavelength. Now, always remember when you look at your electromagnetic spectrum, do you understand electromagnetic spectrum? Let me say, at one end of spectrum is what is called as gamma rays. Then you have something called X-rays. Then you have UV rays. Then you have visible spectrum. Then you have infrared. Then it goes on microwave, radio, TV, all that. Yeah. So this is increasing frequency. I repeat, this what I've just drawn. I will come here again when I talk about radiation pollution. This is the entire electromagnetic spectrum where frequency is lowest on this side, radio wave, TV wave, microwave, and frequency is highest for gamma rays. Yeah. Now we also, if we have not discussed, please understand energy of a wave is directly proportional to its frequency. For those who are, let's say, not from science background, they can remember this proportionality very, very clearly. Energy of a wave is directly proportional to frequency, or the corollary will be it is inversely proportional to the wavelength. Inversely proportional to the wavelength. That's why gamma rays are the most dangerous. They are emitted in your nuclear bomb, as in the nuclear weapon. Yeah, they are high frequency radiation, and anyone who is exposed to gamma rays, you can say he has a case of radiation sickness. Okay, so that's gamma rays. So the reason why I'm saying this, so this is increasing frequency, and what will this side will increase? This is increasing wavelength. Wavelength is lambda, but I'm not getting space, and this increasing wavelength. So here between these three, which has the lowest wavelength? This has the lowest wavelength. Yeah. When something has lowest wavelength, what will this have? This has the highest frequency. Now, highest frequency means high energy as per this equation. Okay. So, if this is clear, you'll be able to answer any question related to which wave is more damaging for us, etc. Okay. Anyone has any questions here? I just want to be sure that you understood it. Even if not, I can explain to you towards the end of the class. Not a problem. So, of all the three, UVC is the most dangerous. Okay, and luckily, you know, the way the atmosphere is formed, perhaps because of which the human life became possible, the most deadliest of UV is completely absorbed by oxygen and ozone in the upper atmosphere. 0% reaches us. Okay, UVB, the middle one, is absorbed by the ozone. As you can see, ozone absorbs UVB. It also partially absorbs UVC. Okay, and only 2 to 3% reaches the Earth's surface. Only UVA reaches the Earth's surface. UVA has to reach the Earth's surface. No, why? Because 400 is UVA, and technically 401 is your visible spectrum. Yeah, remember this in your school days. It's your violet on one end and red on the other. So violet is somewhere around, let's say 450 nanometer, and red will be somewhere around 750 nanometer. Okay, and beyond that is infrared. So UVC anyway cannot be fully absorbed. It eventually reaches the Earth's surface. The reason why I have divided this is the point that I'm trying to drive home is not all UV rays are harmful. UVC is extremely harmful. UVB is somewhat harmful. UVA, whose wavelength is almost close to 400 nanometer, it is as good as visible spectrum, and it is not really that harmful. So there was also this one of this debate that was going on, is that is too much of sunscreen not good for health? Okay. In fact, they also tell you, sunlight also helps you in producing vitamin D. Yeah. So too much of sunscreen, again, it is debatable, but I thought you still know the debate. Many people say too much of sunscreen applied all through regularly is not really good for your body. Why? Because it prevents the formation of vitamin D, which impacts your bone strength. Okay. So, but that's a difficult kind of decision. No, which do you think is more important, life or fair? Being fair. You can still say no, being fair is more important. Again, that's an individual choice. So, but this is a point that the debate is going on, that too much of sunscreen can sometimes be harmful. Okay, and I've also added a news article on the closing of the ozone hole itself. So, for the first time, they say that the ozone hole has completely closed. So, those interested can just click this article and read more about it. It's a very short article in down to earth. You can just read it in less than 5 minutes. Okay. So, what are these ozone depleting substances? What I've tried to do is I've tried to take some of the categories of ozone depleting substances. The first category is chlorofluorocarbon. We all know that chlorofluorocarbon used as coolants in refrigerators and air conditioners. Yeah, just discuss that example. Certain ozone depleting substances are used as fire extinguishers. They are called as brominated fluorocarbons. Brominated. So you are hearing the word bromine, you are hearing chlorine, you are hearing fluoro, which means, though it is really, I really don't want to go to that extent, but sometimes it does ask chlorine, fluorine, bromine, iodine. If you look at it, all of them come in the same column of the periodic table, yeah, which we call as the halogens. So all of them are deadly. So that's one way to remember it. Hey, this column in periodic table is dangerous here as far as ozone depleting substances is there. You'll find chlorine at the top, which has the lowest of the atomic number. Then I think chlorine, bromine, iodine. Yeah. So you are seeing that chloro means problematic, fluoro means problematic, brominated also means problematic. Once again, chloro, methyl chloroform, carbon tetrachloride, hydrochlorofluorocarbon. So clearly, of all these three, this three seems to be most dangerous, very dangerous, of which this guy does the real damage, chlorine. Chlorine is the one which is a real damage. We will see, I think I have a slide on how it really causes the ozone depletion to happen. But I would request you to remember it. Chlorine causes damage, chlorine causes damage, bromine causes damage. Brominated fluorocarbons are called as halogens. So you have various ozone depleting substances being used for various aspects. Broadly, if you look at it, they are solvents, fire extinguishers, coolants, and this aerosols. In fact, this the men's shaving cream also is the one with foam, not our traditional one. The one with foam that is also supposed to be an ozone depleting substance. Yeah. So one way you can really show support to this movement of reducing ozone depleting substances, perhaps is to group here if you are interested in doing that. Okay. So very quickly, I'll take less than a minute of how one CFC can destroy several thousand ozones. Now, this what I have mentioned here happens at stratosphere. The whole steps that I have mentioned here happens at the stratosphere. Yeah. In stratosphere, the interesting thing is oxygen is present as an atom. It is present as a molecule as O2 diatom. It is also present as O3. All three you will find at stratosphere. So now, what is this guy here? There is a chlorine, there is a carbon, there is a fluorine, there is a chlorine. So the one that I'm showing here, this is your CFC. So what has happened? The CFC has reached which phase? It has reached stratosphere. Now what is this arrow mark? This is your sunlight. This is your sunlight. Now sunlight is energy, yeah, and the bond between these is not very strong. So one chlorine atom comes out of. Now what happened to this chlorine? It becomes what is called as a free radical. Now this chlorine atom, what it does is, it goes and what does it do? It reacts with ozone, because we said stratosphere has ozone as an atom, as a molecule, and O3. So it reacts with ozone. Now what does it do? It combines with one oxygen and it causes O2. So far, no. So what has happened? One ozone has got destroyed. Are you able to see this? In step 3, one ozone has got destroyed. Then it goes on. Then what happens? In the stratosphere, I said there is also an oxygen as an atom. So now when these chlorine oxide, if I may call so, comes in touch with oxygen, these two together become O2, which is what is mentioned here. And chlorine once again becomes a free radical. Now, can someone tell me what is going to happen after step 6? Can someone take a guess? Take your time. Which step is, loop, exactly correct, Harsh. Which step is going to repeat after step 6? Between 1 to 5. See the images closely. Tell me which step is going to repeat. Very good, Abhishek. It's step 3. Step 3 is going to happen, no? Because your chlorine has become free and now this happens. Now what happens? One chlorine atom which got dissociated from the CFC can destroy thousands or tens of thousands of ozone. Practically infinite number of ozone, but theoretically infinite number of ozone, but for various practical reasons, which we will not go into, it becomes high funda chemistry. You can say it can kill tens or lakhs of ozone. So one chlorine versus 10,000 ozone. It's almost chlorine is like Rajnikant here. Yeah, single-handedly can tackle 10,000 ozone. Okay, so that was about the mechanics of the ozone depletion, so that you can remember it. Images we generally tend to remember better. We were discussing about Montreal Protocol, and I just touched it upon. And here I really don't want to discuss all the points here, but it is suffice to say that you had this thing called as Vienna Convention. One second. The important points for you to look at this: 1985 Vienna Convention, and Vienna Convention was here, and Montreal Protocol was 1987, and it came into force in 1989. That is okay. You need not remember so much, but what you need to remember from a current affairs perspective is Kigali Amendment. It's there. They've been asking one way or the other. If not in UPSC, at least in some of the state services exam also I've seen Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. Okay. Before that, as I had mentioned in the previous slide also, Montreal Protocol is considered as an example of exceptional international cooperation. Yeah, by none other than Kofi Annan himself. Any idea, Kofi Annan, which organization was he associated with? Which organization? Yeah, very good. He was associated with UN. He was a former Secretary General of UN. Okay, you have Guterres now, but Kofi Annan was a former Secretary General of UN. He considers it as the single most important international agreement till date. Now, when someone like UN Secretary General says this is the single most important agreement till date, obviously you'll be a little curious to know, what is it? How have they been able to do it? And what is there in the Montreal Protocol that is not there in the Kyoto Protocol? Okay, so we have a separate slide for that, which we will discuss. But before that, we will discuss what is it Kigali Amendment to Montreal Protocol. Okay, now when Montreal Protocol started in 1987, the chief villain, so to say, was CFC and halogens, the brominated chlorofluorocarbon, etc., which the chief villain were these guys. This, yeah, all these were considered not this but this at the time of Montreal Protocol. These were considered as the chief villain. Now, with time, the world agreed to phase out, but at the same time, you need something as a coolant, you need something as a refrigerant, you need something as a vapor decreaser, you need something as a fire extinguisher. To a good extent, hydrofluorocarbon came as a substitute for chlorofluorocarbon. In fact, it may be a little confusing here. All three are different. Chlorofluorocarbon is different from hydrochlorofluorocarbon, which is different from hydrofluorocarbon. Yeah. So if you look at it, what is not there in hydrofluorocarbon? Chlorine is not there. This guy has chlorine. This guy also has chlorine. So chlorine is not there. Therefore, HFC is considered as very good when it comes to prevention of ozone depletion. Okay. So under Kigali Amendment, by the time of Kigali Amendment or much before, it came to be known that, okay, so HFC is very good when it comes to prevention of ozone depletion, but it is very bad when it comes to global warming potential. Do you recollect that slide in global warming potential where I have mentioned that HFC 23, it has a global warming potential of 12,000 to 14,000. So you are helping the humanity when it comes to ozone depletion, but you are not at all helping when it comes to GHG emission. So what Kigali Amendment said, that we have to bring down the hydrofluorocarbon consumption or utilization by 80%, means reduce it to 20% over the next 30 years. Okay. Now the reason why this becomes important from a current affairs point of view is, few months back, the Union Cabinet ratified the Kigali Amendment. which means India has legally bound itself to Kigali Amendment, saying that we will reduce the hydrofluorocarbon consumption by 2047. So this is like given in writing. You've given it in writing. So India, there was a slightly what should I say, lenient target, whereas for developed countries, 2026, 36 was the target for US and other things. Okay? And overall, this has been, as Kofi Annan has rightly said, this has been considered as one of the best or a model international agreement made not just in environment but in any field altogether. Okay. Now that brings us to perhaps the last topic of today's class. Yeah, India and climate change. I'll just touch upon, but practically this is going to be the last topic of today's class. Comparison of Montreal Protocol and UNFCCC. The first thing is, from a prelims or mains perspective, please understand that 2022 marks 30 years of UNFCCC. Because when was it? 1992. So the year when you will be writing your prelims, 30 years have passed since UNFCCC came into existence, and 35 years have passed since Montreal Protocol came into existence. In terms of their size, their impact, the number of countries involved, these are considered as the two most important multilateral environmental agreements. MEA. Okay, we have talked about Kigali, which is the second part. The key, the crux is this. Yeah, maybe you have a paper and pen, you can note also. The fundamental difference between Montreal Protocol and Kyoto Protocol is this term. Montreal talks about common responsibility and respective capability. Now, what does this mean? Common responsibility. Reducing ozone depleting substances is a common responsibility. Therefore, all have to work together. And respective capability. Here, it respects the development trajectory at which a country is. Respective capability. Rwanda cannot be expected to do the Montreal, do the ozone depleting substance at the same pace as US. Yeah, Vietnam cannot be expected to remove ozone depleting substance at the same pace that Canada can. So common responsibility. The responsibility is common for all, but the pace at which each country will do is respective capability. Whereas in UNFCCC, the killer clause was common but differentiated responsibility, and rest everything remains the same and respective capability. Yeah. So this word differentiated responsibility. If you remember the very first class, I talked about two kids fighting and one kid invoking the other kid's family. Then the problem starts. The moment we started saying, and we are factually correct, and there is nothing wrong in saying we are factually correct. The industrialization there started 100 years before. So by the time India started emitting, let's say India set up its steel plant, under Nehru's vision of having integrated steel plant. In the 50s, 60s, some of it went up to early 70s also. At that time only we started emitting. Whereas US and other countries, they started emitting way back in the late 19th century itself. So they were emitting for 70 years when India was emitting almost nil. So the common but differentiated responsibility, what it did, it made the developed countries to step back a little. It will be really interesting to watch what position India takes in this Glasgow summit, because even yesterday I read an article why India should not sign for a net zero emission under this Glasgow agreement. Okay, and any idea where this Kigali is? Just struck me that I have mentioned this. Which country? Any idea? African country it is. Very good, Bhavna. Good. Rwanda. Rwanda. Yes, sir. That's correct. So Rwanda is the country where it's the capital. Kigali is the capital of Rwanda. And the other point that you can remember purely from a film's perspective is it is the first legally binding treaty of the 20th century. It's first internationally legally binding treaty of the 20th century. That's the distinction of Kigali agreement. Okay. In the next class, which is going to be Friday, we will move. So with ozone, I have completed the global wala fully. Okay, there is nothing really left. Of course, there may be some pockets of current affairs which I have not covered. But overall, I would intend to move towards India and climate change because many times the questions are focused on India. Now, before coming to India, it's good that we have looked at the global level. Now we can focus on India. So some really interesting topics for Friday, because I myself felt very extremely interested on what should be India's stance. Okay, so what is US trying to do? What is the concept of net zero emission? Why is India a little reluctant to sign on the dotted line as far as net emission is concerned? There is this concept on net zero producers forum. So some of countries have come together. They are putting additional pressure by each one of them voluntarily saying that we'll produce net zero. Then we will look at national action plan on climate change, in which we will focus on these two major initiatives, one on solar energy, another on energy efficiency. We will look at all of that. And then we will look at some more concepts in India. What is carbon market? What is black carbon? And how is it threatening Himalayan glaciers? And some of the other current affairs. So now, once I start India, all current affairs will also be related to India. And we look at some of the government schemes, Ujala scheme, the street lighting program scheme, and all of that. So now, actually, if I see, so far what we have discussed, perhaps in terms of its contribution to prelims, it is very minimal. Its contribution to your overall understanding is very good, what we have discussed in class 4. But what will really get you marks, or what will really help you to write a good answer both in GS3 and very interesting, I don't know how many of you have realized this, what we are teaching will also help you in GS1, because they club it under the heading resources. So they give it a very wide meaning of the word resource. Okay, so some of the things that we discuss under environment will not just be part of GS3, but will also spill over to GS1. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of this class number 4. If anyone has any specific questions, you can stay back. Otherwise, I am more or less done from my side. Thank you for joining today's call. I hope to see you tomorrow, on Friday at the same time. So a recurring invite has been sent to all of you guys. Recurring invite means I have sent it only today. It will automatically keep coming to you on Wednesday and Friday. And I'll make it a point to send you notes for Friday in advance, so that you can maybe prepare or read well, or you can connect better and come. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you so much. So as always, if anyone has questions, they can